Hello there, Virtual Space Hero community. A very warm welcome this Thursday evening for our weekly Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live. As usual, as every week, we are streaming on 3 channels. Our main channel, LinkedIn, here. We're streaming also on Facebook, and we're also welcoming our community members from our YouTube channel. So let us know where you are connecting from each channel. You can leave us a short message in the chat. And with that, we are already going directly and jumping into the topic, because last week we had the tremendous pleasure to discuss super in-depth the role of a virtual MC. So we were talking a lot about how to make people feel comfortable when we talk about virtual events and so on. What is the role, the new skill set that is needed? Today, we are continuing to stay in the virtual space. We are going to shift towards remote work, virtual work and remote work. And we are going to pick up on a topic that was already on our agenda here in the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live show. We're going to talk about storytelling. So what we did is we discussed storytelling and the usage of fairy tales in trainings. And today we are going to talk about how we can lead with stories at work and communicate with influence. And I'm super happy to have with me Rance Greene, the story designer and founder and creator from Stories at Work. Hi there, Rance.
Hello, Barbara, and hello, listening community. It's so good to be on the Virtual Space Heroes.
Thank you very much, Rance. Let us know where you're connecting from.
Hey, I'm from Dallas, Texas, United States of America, and it's great to be joining people from all over the globe today, this morning, this evening, wherever you are.
Fantastic. Also, we have somebody connecting here from Jamaica. Hi there, Sasha K. And to all the other Virtual Space Hero community members, let us know where you're connecting from. Type directly into the chat. Rance, I'm super happy that you had time and agreed to my invitation here. Let me know, how did you, or let us all know, how did you get into the topic of story design and storytelling? What is your journey?
Sure. Thank you. And I'm happy to share a little bit about how I got into this story design business anyway. So my background is in theater. I have a degree in acting, I have a master's in choreography. So I spent a great deal of my education and a lot of my early career experience getting into the creative process, like finding out the creative process for myself and defining what that was. And then I had a life change in New York City and began to do full-time ministry with inner city youth in New York. And the way that I found to connect with those youth was really through telling stories, either stories of faith or stories, my personal stories, or even fictional stories. And as I opened up to them, they opened up to me, and I saw a great way of connecting with people and building relationships through storytelling. So with that background, I came into the talent development world and just brought all of that with me. And as I began to train people on how to, or I began to train people through storytelling, and then began to train others how to train people on storytelling, and then eventually how to help leaders to tell better stories in the workplace. So a little bit of a circuitous route to where I got to, but storytelling has always been that thread that has taken it all the way through.
So you are now working mainly with organizations and institutions on how leaders can use stories at work, correct?
There's 2 arms to needastory.com. One arm is for talent development folks. And you probably have a lot of those people on this call today, on this LinkedIn Live session. You do a lot with virtual training people and all that, Barbara. So if you are interested in learning more about instructional story design, that is one arm of the organization. And the other arm, yes, is focused on teaching leaders how to tell better stories at work.
Okay. Cool. I think that's really interesting because I already with Charles-Louis Demar, we talked about how we can use stories and fairy tales in training design and in our trainings, but we have never talked about here in the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live show about how to lead with
Mm,
stories at work. So let us know a little bit on how do you define story and storytelling? What is that for you?
yes. Well, I'd like for everybody on the call today to think about what is your favorite story. Just think about that story for a minute. What attracts you to that story? What is it about that story that you keep coming back to, that you like about it so much? Maybe Barbara, you can share a little bit about why you are attracted to one of your favorite stories.
I think I was just wondering because I was now, first of all, I came immediately with stories from my private context. So I needed to refocus a little bit to think about stories from the workplace. But I think what happens usually with stories is that it's like you trigger emotions.
Hmm.
And of course, it makes it more personal. The moment it becomes more personal, it gets more personal. I think it's also where it's easier to remember or to remind it.
Right, right. Thank you. So, yeah, and I don't know that we need to totally separate stories in our personal life and stories at work quite yet. Because the things that attract us to stories in our personal lives are so useful in stories at work. And so, for instance, when you talked about establishing that emotional connection, I mean, just at the beginning of this broadcast, you asked me, what's your story, Rance? Tell us a little bit about your story. Why do you ask a question like that? Because you want to connect with me in some way. And so I've shared a little bit of myself with you so that you are able then to, connect with me, and your listeners
Mhm,
connect with me a little bit more.
mhm, mhm,
Um,
mhm,
so how I define stories at work, um, and especially in a leadership kind of context, is um, stories at work have a specific purpose. It's not, when you're sitting down at a meeting and somebody asks you for the financial report, you don't hand them a story, right? You hand them the financial report. If they're saying, hey, what's the status? What are you working on today? Probably what they want to know is what you're working on today. They don't want to know a story. But there are times at work when you do need a story. And how I define stories are this: relatable characters and strong conflict. Putting these two things together have a wonderful effect. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But the reason why you're telling a story at work is because you want to affect a change. That's the
mhm,
appropriate time to bring a story in at work, especially when you're leading. You want a change to happen in your team, in your division, in your customers. You want some sort of change to happen, and that change varies from a change in relationship all the way to a change in commitment, to a change in perspective. There are different types of change that need to happen in the workplace. And when you
mhm,
are when
mhm.
you are speaking to people and communicating to people that those changes need to happen, man, a story is going to superpower that message.
I think that's fantastic because you already answered one of my first questions. Why should we really use the stories at work, right? But you also mentioned like those, the conflict that should be happening or that should be there in a good story. What are other elements that you would say? You also said like relatable people or
Yes.
characters, or what was your wording?
Yes, yes, excellent. Yes, relatable characters. So when I ask, okay, when I ask an audience, whenever I'm doing a workshop or I'm speaking like this, I'll often ask the audience, what are the elements of a story? Any story. Think about the newspapers that you read. Think about the stories that you tell at the dinner table. Think about the stories that you consume, you hear, you watch. And often I'll get a long list of elements: plot, hero's journey, characters, a problem, a resolution, because we know what stories are. We know the elements of a story. What I like to do is to whittle that down to two basic elements of a story that really are essential for stories at work, and that is relatable characters and strong conflict. And I use those terms pretty specifically, because the characters in the story need to be somebody that I can relate to. It doesn't have to be exactly me, but I need to have some empathy for that character. If you have been to, I once attended a town hall, and the CEO started talking about that she went touring in her tugboat in the Bahamas, and this story, and I'm like, just cannot relate with that. So she kind of missed the mark there, and everybody was like, "What? What?"
Yeah.
So it's easy to miss that relatable part of relatable characters. If that character is you, if you're telling a personal story, find that relatableness between you and your audience. And then I also use the word strong conflict, because it needs to be as strong as possible. If you're watching a movie and there is absolutely no conflict and everything is going right for the character, you walk out of the theater like, this is the most boring thing. There has to be some element of conflict, some change that is happening within that character, if you're going to maintain that audience's attention. So those are the two story elements that I think are essential to telling a story at work.
And when you talk about the relatable character, that's also what you mean by speaking the language of the audience. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the only way you'll be able to speak that language is if you know who your audience is. So I like to ask people, okay, define who your audience is. Just tell me two things about them. First of all, what do you want them to do as a result of your message? Your message needs to stir some kind of reaction from your audience, and one of them is that they do something. The second is, how do you want your audience to feel as a result of your message? And if you can identify what you want them to do and how you want them to feel, you're at a good place to begin crafting a message for them. Just the message itself. I mean, set the story aside. A lot of times I think we go into a meeting and we have this idea of, I'm going to cover these bullet points that I have on my list, on my agenda, and I'm just going to disseminate information, and they'll just do something with it. But there's no intent behind that message. But when we become intentional about that, then I have some guidance then on how to craft that message. And I even have an evaluation tool. I know if the audience actually did what I was hoping they would do, then my message was successful. Yeah.
Let me ask you here a question. So, because that also relatable characters and speaking the language of the audience and the strong conflict as the basics for a good story at work. But how would you teach, or how do you train when you work with company leaders? How do you train them how to build a good story? So is that something that you can do? Are there sort of steps to follow or some criteria to consider?
Yes. So I have a model called the story design model, and it starts with the two story elements that we talked about. So if you have stories up here, if you have your story, and you're wanting to connect that story to the action you want your audience to take, we talked about that, what they should do and how they should feel as a result. Then there's some space in between that we need to fill in. So the first two pieces are the actual story elements, the relatable characters and the strong conflict, which will produce in your audience this desire for resolution if you do it right. So how do you put those together then? I think that's what you're asking. How do you actually craft that story?
Exactly.
So I like to start with a story premise. And I call it a story premise, and it's basically a fill in the blank. So
what does it mean? Sorry, I didn't understand. The story premise. What do you mean with that?
Sure. Well, let me describe it to you in detail. And so a premise is what is this story all about? What is this story? What is the conflict of the story, and who is the person in the story? And so it would be it starts off a story about, and the first blank that you fill in is the relatable character. And that can be the name of the character, their position in the company, etc. And so that's the first part. It's a story about this person. And the second part is this: who is struggling to fill in the blank with the action that you're hoping your audience will take as a result. And so now you have a story about Tom, who is a marketing analyst who is struggling to embrace the new marketing plan. So that I liked for leaders to actually plug in their reality, like what exists today. Who are you speaking to? So if you're speaking to a group of analysts, and Tom is one of them, put Tom's name in there. He's a market analyst. And what are you hoping that he will do as a result of this? You're hoping that he will embrace this new marketing strategy that you have. And so he's struggling to do that. Okay. He is struggling to do that. So now that you have kind of like a picture of who your audience is, now come to it to on the story side. Okay. And you want to create a character who mirrors your actual audience. That character could be you, the person speaking. And so if Isabel is the head of marketing, she can put herself in there and think of a story that reflects from her life that matches the story of her story premise. So think of your real audience, what they're actually struggling with. Is there a moment in your life when you struggle with embracing a new concept, embracing something new? Now you have something a little more concrete to reach back and recall from your own life and bring to the forefront and tell that story and include all the conflict that went along with it. This is what I felt when when I had to encounter this new thing. This is how I dealt with it. This is how I failed in doing it. But this is how we are going to succeed, and then connect it back to your message to make the story powerful. And I think that a lot of times, Barbara, that when leaders come up and they tell stories, they think of stories as compartmentalized. Okay, I've told the story, now I can get on to my agenda. But you have to connect that story to the message in order for it to really hone in and make its impact. And that's where that link gets broken sometimes. So when you're crafting that story, keep in mind, I'm going to use this story to make a powerful point regarding the action that I want my audience to take. Does that help give some context around the mechanics?
Absolutely, absolutely. So for me, it became much, much clearer. But let me just as a practical understanding, if you work with companies, if you work with managers, do they bring you an example and you go through the example story, for example, do you go through that and analyze it and work with them on all these premises, factors that you define to be important for a strong story at work?
Yes, I think a lot of times, as maybe yourself as a talent developer, as someone who does virtual training, that there's a great bit of analysis that happens before any kind of design begins. And the same is true here. I don't call it analysis. I call it reflection. And so I help them through those steps of reflection. I say, okay, tell me a little bit about who you're speaking to. Tell me a little bit about what you hope to accomplish as a result of this message. How do you want your audience to feel? And the moment you get to that feeling part, things start to click. They're like, oh, you're asking me to get into the shoes of my audience. Yes, I am. And that point of when they come to that realization, like, oh, I get it now. I need to be aware of who my audience is. I need to actually have a purpose for this message. Then, boom, it starts to flow. And that creative part doesn't become so daunting anymore. And they're able to take it from there.
Mm-mm-mm. Super good example. Thanks a lot, Rance. It became much clearer. And I just have another follow-up question. So you were also in one of your articles, you were writing about the why and why the why matters. So why does the why matter? And you were also in that article, what I enjoyed reading a lot, you were also talking about different messages like connect, encourage, guide, and persuade.
Yes, yes. So that's a very popular phrase, isn't it? Right? Know your why. Know why you do what you do. Know the purpose behind your life. What you do in your life. Know the purpose behind your work. Well, the same is true with your story. Know the why behind the story before you begin to write your message. And thank you for mentioning the Stories at Work articles and videos, because I feel like they're a really great resource of just like getting a foundational knowledge of how to tell stories at work. But yeah, you mentioned the four purposes of connecting with people, guiding people, encouraging people, and persuading people. So the model of leadership storytelling really involves those four purposes. You can boil down pretty much any message that you have as a leader to your organization into those four categories. You either want to connect with people, you want to encourage or inspire them, you want to guide them to a new way, or you want to persuade them. And you can take business stories and really funnel it down to those four purposes. And once you know the purpose behind why you are delivering the message and the purpose behind your story, everything else starts to fall into place. For instance, if I know that my purpose is to inspire people, let's say this marketing person has this new marketing plan, this marketing leader, and they want to inspire their audience to get hold of this new marketing plan and run with it. So if this person is a brand new person to the company, probably they're going to take a step back and tell a story that connects them to their audience. If they've been there for a while, they're connected, they know them, and they've already earned the trust of their audience, okay, let's move on then to inspire. Let's inspire them to take on this new plan. And there's several methods they can use to do that. But if they know that it is to inspire, then if they use the model, they can go down the model and see, okay, if I'm inspiring people, then I am looking for a change in perspective. This is how people view things right now. And I need to change that because we are going a different direction now. And I need to give them a new perspective. And that new perspective can inspire them forward if I can make them uncomfortable enough with what is current.
I think it's very interesting because it connects so much to everything we're discussing also in the learning and development field, that it's so important to first know maybe it's not the why, or maybe it's the why we're doing something, but it's the what is the learning objective, right? Because if I don't know the what, and that's what you call the why in this case, I cannot clearly work on my message or on the story in this case, or on the activity if we talk about the learning, about the training, right?
That's correct. Yeah. And I think that's a great analogy. And especially, I think that, learning and development, people understand this probably better than a lot of leaders because we know the value of that analysis that happens on the front end to make the end result actionable. And there's nothing like stories to make things actionable, because when you're watching a story, when you're seeing it unfold, when you're hearing a leader tell a story that really resonates with you, it's like you're living it out yourself. It's firing all those neurons just like a flight simulator and preparing you to take action, just like as if you were a pilot in a flight simulator. And all of those neurons that are firing in the flight simulator are the same ones that need to be firing in the real story. And that can be translated into storytelling for training or storytelling for leading. So great point. And I think that your audience in particular will be like really grasp onto that quickly, because as talent developers, we're used to the analysis on the front end. in order to come up with the best result.
Let me ask you one last question, Rance, because I think that was also one of your blog articles. I'm going to immediately also type it in here at the bottom so that people definitely follow you and your blog articles, because they're very inspiring. And there was one about the 4 types of stories you'll tell at work. So what are those stories? Could you just maybe give us a glimpse on it? And then for the rest, we're sharing the blog article, right?
Sure, I will. So if you think about the 4 purposes of stories, I'll just briefly talk about connect. If you have a connect story that you want to tell, probably the type of story you're going to want to tell is a personal story, one that is from your own life. If you want to inspire people, and remember you wanted to inspire that change in perspective, hypotheticals, that's what I call them, kind of seeing into the future and painting a picture of what's to come and kind of the struggle of what is actually here today, is a great story to tell. If you're guiding people, man, go for the case studies. Let's look at what's happening in our business right now. This customer called in with this complaint. What went wrong? Let's look at it and piece it apart and find out what we can do better. And then lastly, if you're trying to persuade people, you're trying to change their commitment to buy your product, to give your department funding, whatever it is, then metaphors are a great way to give people who don't know about your product and give them something familiar to relate to the unfamiliar. And of course, those 4 story types can be mixed and put into the different purposes in any way or shape or fashion, but they kind of fall into those natural categories.
So I truly, I think what would be, I'm truly thinking about what would be a first step for me, for example, if I think about a team. So I would need to think about what is the challenge, what change, or what is the message that I want to communicate, right? And then think about what happened to me that those people could relate to in order to achieve the goal, whether it's a change or whatever it is.
Yes, that's a great way to approach it. And I would say also you want to identify what do you want them to do as a result of this message and how do you want them to feel. And if at any point, if you're not really looking for a change or if you're not really expecting them to do something, a story is probably not appropriate for that message. But if there is, you've got a good case for a business story.
Rance, thank you so much for being with us. It was really amazing. Very good insights. And I hope you out there that let us know also in the chat now or later on, what kind of story did you use? Let us know a little bit about what is going on at your end so that we can afterwards communicate with you also after the LinkedIn Live. Rance, it was fantastic. Thanks a lot for sharing all your knowledge and all your content with us here on the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live show. And you know that I prepared a virtual cocktail for you backstage, so I'm going to be there with you in a minute. Thank you very much for being with us. See you in a bit.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, guys.
Bye. Thank you very much for being with us, Virtual Space Hero community. And don't forget, Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live show every Thursday at 6 p.m. And the whole guest lineup is online already until June 2021. So go to our webpage, virtualspacehero.com, and check out all the topics around the virtual space that we are going to cover. Thanks a lot for contributing. Thanks also for sending your questions beforehand. I hope we covered all of them. If there is still something left unanswered, don't worry. Just type in and tag Rance and me in your question, and we're happy to answer that. And with that, well, become a hero of the virtual space, become a virtual space hero, and let's stay connected. Bye.